Okay. Okay. Hello, can everyone hear me okay? Okay. My name is Vanessa Greiver. I'm the events coordinator at Politics and Prose, and I'd like to welcome you on behalf of the owners, Barbara and Carla, and of the staff. There are a few free seats around the front if anybody wants to come up. Today Pete Daniel is speaking on Lost Revolutions, the South in the 1950s. And it's funny because in organizing this with Pete, we've had a few conversations, and he's been to the store. And our conversations are always about logistics. You know, when's the event going to be? How long does he need to speak for? Blah, blah, blah. And he always manages to completely make me feel like the stupidest person. Like, he mentioned... He manages, no, I make myself feel like the stupidest person. He mentions like 4 or 5 things that, you know, just kind of cultural anecdotes or something that I'm supposed to understand and know, and I never do. And we always have this, like, I always have this semi-puzzled look on my face. I'm, like, supposed to know all these things about the South. Pete Daniel, these things that to me are really obscure, but obviously not so much. And, he lives in this world of the South, and it's constantly coming up, is what I'm trying to say. And I can't think of anyone more qualified to write this book. He paints these vivid, funny portraits filled with anecdotes and quotations of the South in the 50s, and ends up painting a portrait of the South that's actually very different from the cultural portrait that we have kind of out there of what the South was like in the 50s. So it's with great pleasure that I introduce Pete Daniel to you.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. My 2 daughters, Lisa and Laura, to whom the book is dedicated, couldn't be here tonight, but 2 out of 3 of my grandchildren made it, Julie and Nicholas Carbow. And their grandmother, Bonnie, whose birthday it is today. I was sternly warned by 2 of my colleagues, who are not here yet, that I would have to talk about myself tonight, something that I don't usually do. But they said that people had rather hear me talk about how I did the book than to read from it. When I was thinking about what to discuss this evening, it occurred to me that when I first started this book, it was like looking at pieces of a puzzle with no picture to guide me, and I just had a few pieces there. The other pieces were hidden in libraries and archives. The total picture would only emerge after I found and put together the pieces. A decade ago, I started on the puzzle, working on chemicals, rural music, and the legal basis of agribusiness. Still, when a fellowship relieved me of my daily rounds as a curator in 1994 to tour Southern archives and look for the puzzle pieces, I still didn't know very much about where I was going. A month later, I was in Nashville and had lunch with Vanderbilt professor Paul Konkin. Dr. Konkin had taught me intellectual history at the University of Maryland in 1966-67. The first thing he asked me is, "What is your hypothesis?" And I allowed as to how at that moment I didn't have a hypothesis. It was hard to explain to him that I was constantly running around trying to find pieces to this puzzle. What I was learning was not what I recall from growing up in the 50s, nor did it support most of the scholarship that portrayed the South during the 50s as a calm, dull, apathetic time that was simply the prelude to the 60s. At that moment, I had just been in the Vanderbilt archives and had discovered that fugitive poet, historian, musician, and Vanderbilt professor Donald Davidson led a Tennessee segregationist group. Why did segregation mean so much to this Southern scholar? or to Wesley Critz George, who headed the North Carolina Patriots, another segregationist group, who was a professor at the University of North Carolina Medical School. Who were these segregationists in the 50s who claimed to be the best white men? As I drove across the South visiting archives, it occurred to me that this was an extraordinary time in human history. Driving a car, listening to music, free to go where I pleased, and always arriving at a destination where I could find more pieces to this puzzle. And archivists and librarians, of course, were invariably helpful, many of them going far beyond call of duty. In the fullness of time, I accumulated enough pieces of the puzzle to start putting it together. This means that you sit down and begin writing. And of course, I love it, and so much so that I can't find words to talk about it, so I won't. But it's really something I love to do. So that's how farmers, bureaucrats, fire ants, pesticide residues, stock car drivers, rock and roll artists, segregationists, integrationists, heroes, and villains ended up in the book. At one point, the typescript rose to 1,000 pages. Ultimately, entire chapters were purged, others were savaged. What I had written on politicians vanished because so much had been done on politics. And there was no use discussing things that other authors had done so well. From the beginning, it was clear that World War II had enormous implications for Southerners. They emerged from the war elated, confused, and eager to forget about the Depression and forget about the war. They hoped for a better day. But segregation remained a dominant issue, as I'm sure most of you realize. Whites, for the most part, believed that African Americans were content with segregation, and they seldom asked what the situation really was, except perhaps to inquire of their chauffeur or some of their household help, who invariably gave them the answer they wanted to hear. And at one point, I thought I could probably write a chapter on the misleading information supplied by house servants to the people who wanted to hear that everything was fine in the South. There were a lot of possibilities for change, but the old guard held on. They more than held on. They created a solid wall of opposition to integration and punished anyone who opposed them. They were ruthless. Yet, white males controlled everything in the South. What fear drove these men who controlled politics, economics, and social relations? Then there's the haunting question of why no group of whites formed an opposition party. It has been typical of historical scholarship to see civil rights as separate from the rural transformation that sent millions of people from the land. I included aspects of civil rights in the chapters on agriculture and aspects of rural life in the chapters on civil rights. Some of you may be familiar with the U.S. Department of Agriculture's dismal, perhaps criminal record on civil rights. That only 18,000 black farmers are left in this country is no accident. The legal questions that inform this chapter on agriculture originated in the 1992 Commonwealth Fund lecture at University College London and appeared in print as the legal basis of agrarian capitalism. New Deal agricultural reforms removed most disputes between landlords and tenants from local and state courts and vested this in local committees composed of the rural elite. These committees allotted acreage, which meant they could tell you how much to grow. They mediated labor disputes, and they dictated the rise of mechanization and the spread of chemicals. Each county in the country had such committees. And in the South, these committees were also linked to the Farm Bureau. Such a structure proved useful in opposing civil rights, and I suggest that historians need to look much more closely at this aspect of white opposition. Had I not worked on Science in American Life, an exhibit at the Smithsonian, there probably would have been no chapter on chemicals. My research assistant, Louis Hutchins, discovered in the National Archives a catch of material relating to fire ants, which led to an article. Then Edmund Russell arrived at the museum as a predoctoral fellow and inspired me with his meticulous scholarship and startling revelations. To my surprise, I discovered that the proliferation of synthetic and very effective chemicals after World War II created a new body of liability law. While several colleagues at the museum read an early draft of this chapter and gave me some suggestions, they kidded me. What do you really think about the Agricultural Research Service? What puzzled me was that for chemical advocates, nature simply wasn't good enough. And of course, this ideology continues. Today, for example, genetically modified organisms promise the brave new world, the latest rejection of nature. I still recall the day at the National Archives when Rebecca Lynch and I discovered photographs of the administrators at the Agricultural Research Service who covered up the extent of pesticide residues in milk and meat and defended the dreadful fire ant campaign. They look just like your next-door neighbor. Book 2, and this book is divided into 3 books. Book 2 deals with low culture. I may come back and read a little bit from this chemical chapter, but I want to go sort of plow along for a little ways here. Low culture, which I expect some readers may be offended by this term, which I call low down mostly through this chapter. But working class culture is not an adequate term for what I was discussing. I wanted to find a term that had not been used in this context. I wanted it to have an edge. I wanted it to encompass both blacks and whites. Many of the people who appear in these 3 chapters were wild, talented, and fearless. Most came from poor families. My discussion of the lowdown culture that produced rock and roll and stock car racing raises questions that go to the heart of American culture. In the South, I argue, it was low-down people who were the most creative. The move from rural to urban sites and the timely opportunities to record music or drive stock cars unleashed a wave of innovation that still contains cultural power. In this context, Sam Phillips and Bill France emerge as 2 of the most savvy producers of the mid-20th century. And I want to read a few little things here at the risk of boring you, taking up too much time. This is a little bit about the explanation of how I arrived at lowdown culture. Many Southerners doubted the need for education. Men and women passed down to their children the knowledge and skills that they had learned from their parents and practiced throughout their lives. Black and white farmers raised the same crops, worshiped the same God, received the same rainfall, and shared the same basic vocabulary. Without formal English instruction, Southerners developed playful speech. Both African Americans and their white neighbors lacked access to education and became grammatical heretics, lapsing into syntactical aberrations and malapropisms that suggested to some ignorance rather than calculated insolence. Southern segregation laws were insufficient to block the exchange of counterfeit linguistics. Because black and white people were often neighbors, music, language, dress, religion, Saturday night partying, and even yard art were an alternating current that moved between neighbors, communities, counties, and states. Especially when it came to exchanging something offensive to the upper class, racial barriers collapsed. Lowdown Southerners bent both grammatical rules and musical notes to their purposes. Some of the book is based largely on interviews. I had the good fortune to interview Junior Johnson, a quiet mountain man who dislikes to talk, who answers most questions with as close to yes or no as he can manage. One thing that still sticks in my mind is his use of nerve, which he applied to what it takes to drive a stock car. But it was the inflection he used that was so striking. Many of the drivers in the early days, of course, learned to drive fast by hauling liquor across mountain roads and chased by the law. And I go into this, but these people were extremely brave and talented as drivers. It was this untamed streak that fascinated race fans and alarmed sponsors. An entire folklore emerged about these drivers: Curtis Turner, the Flocks, Bob, Fonte, Tim, Ethel. About Louise Smith, Fireball Roberts, Joe Weatherly, Junior Johnson, Lee Petty, Buck Baker, to name a few. It was not widely known that Wendell Scott, an African-American driver, competed in NASCAR during the most intense days of the Civil Rights Movement in the late 50s and through the 60s, or that Louise Smith, Ethel Flock, and Sarah Christian competed on equal terms in NASCAR during the early 50s. These were not complacent people. Something happened in the move from farm to city that unleashed creativity. Bill France, who was the founder of NASCAR, molded wild young drivers, mechanics, and hangers-on into what is now one of the country's most dominant forms of entertainment. Ultimately, of course, sponsors won. After I had completed an interview with Junior Johnson in 1988 at Dover, Delaware, we were leaving his transporter and walking back through the pits, and we'd been talking about what had changed, and he looked around and just said with resignation, "It's all been tamed now." Working on the Rock and Soul Social Crossroads exhibit, which is now a Smithsonian-sponsored exhibit that's in Memphis, gave me the opportunity to interview dozens of musicians and those connected with the music business. Facing Sam Phillips with those demonic eyes and self-assurance was explanation of enough of how he came to record some of the most important black and white musicians of the 20th century. He was so intense that the cameraman couldn't look through the eyepiece very long at a time. Of course, I was totally enraptured by him. When the exhibit opened, and I mixed with Sam Phillips, Rufus Thomas, Billy Lee Riley, Jerry Lee Lewis, David Porter, Sonny Burgess, and others, I felt extremely privileged to have interviewed them and to have done an exhibit that to some extent placed this movement in historical context. As I stood in front of the control room, part of the exhibit, flanked on either side by cases of the black Sun performers on one side and the white Sun performers on the other, containing their clothing, instruments, and other artifacts, I told Sam Phillips that no one else could have done this. And he almost argued with me, but he just blinked. Let me read you a little section here on Billy Lee Riley. Billy Lee Riley doubted that he would have ventured into Sun Studio alone. Music promoter Jack Clement recorded Riley's Trouble Bound in a garage studio and took it to Phillips, who released it in May 1956. Born in Pocahontas, Arkansas in 1933, Riley spent his early years moving with his family around the northeastern part of the state. His father sought work as a house painter, but often sharecropped to put food on the table. Billy Lee Riley gave a telling description of sharecropping. We'd plant it with a two-row planter pulled by horses, mules. Then we would chop it, pick it, and starve to death in the wintertime. Like a lot of Southerners, especially like Harry Cruz, you may remember, rural kids took the Sears and Roebuck catalog and played games with it. Billy Lee said, "We'd sit there every year and tally up everything we wanted before school was supposed to start," he remembered. "We would have it all down, man, and it never came true. I always wanted a Mackinaw jacket, and I never had nothing. Never had a coat, never had a pair of boots." And then from Sam Phillips and how I see him and the people he recorded, Phillips' recollection of these musicians is tinged with both condescension and admiration. They came to Sun, he remembered, almost hat in hand, insecure, snaggle-toothed, prematurely bald, and carrying beat-up instruments. In Phillips, they found a mentor who could, like a plantation owner, manipulate their rural work ethic and transform the rough seeds of their music into a lucrative crop of records. They were just as concerned as their parents had been about whether they were receiving a fair settlement. In other respects, Phillips resembled a cult leader as he brooded in the Sun control room, demanding a conversion experience from country to rock and roll. It's Stock car racing and rock and roll provided space for people who were growing up or growing jaded by 9-to-5 jobs. It gave them space to raise hell, drink, curse, fight, and generally reclaim some of the self-esteem that the whip, pistol, and chair of corporate America tried to control. While much of the edge of lowdown culture has been blunted, there's still enough to make some people feel uneasy. Of course, much of what now is supposed to be lowdown culture is neo-lowdown. You know you are really a redneck if you want to do something particularly nasty to Jeff Foxworthy. Because I wanted a candid opinion of the chapter A Little of the Rebel, I sent it to John Howard. By the way, I highly recommend his recent book, Men Like That. John offered keen insight into some of the photographs and responded with a favorable reading. But he did not like the title, which at that time was Other Southerners. John reminded me that I had not dealt with any Southerners, black or white, men or women, young or old, homosexual or straight, as others. It's a sobering read of the title. I want to read you a little bit of something on somebody you've never heard of, Elvis Presley. Although Presley electrified women fans, his appeal to men refracted. Scotty Moore insisted that Presley was heterosexual, even homophobic. Let's face it, Moore added, the man was damn near too pretty to be a man. Presley had admired actor Tony Curtis's use of mascara and heard that it accentuated the eyes in photographs. Whatever Presley's reasons for wearing eyeshadow, people's reactions to it varied. When Presley appeared at the Grand Ole Opry in October 1954, a worldly Chet Atkins declared, "I couldn't get over that eyeshadow he was wearing. It was like seeing a couple of guys kissing in Key West." In the estimation of the Rolling Stones' Mick Jagger, the androgynous side of rock and roll originated with Elvis Presley. Older people feared Presley, Jagger suggested, because they saw him as an effeminate guy. In photographs of Presley, Jagger continued, the eyes are done with makeup and everything's perfect. The Rolling Stones became androgynous straight away, unconsciously, Jagger added. With his Lansky Brothers wardrobe and his Tony Curtis eyes, Presley represented both a surrogate black man and a transvestite. Androgyny, then, was yet another manifestation of 1950s culture. Part of the Presley magic was his plasticity, which enveloped diverse listeners and trapped their loyalty. Presley's music and style sent out beams across a broad spectrum. Fatal Divisions, the last section of the book, is about civil rights in the post-Brown v. Board of Education South. The exodus of rural people to towns and cities across the country, to reiterate, had changed not only their residents, but it also altered the landscape left behind. With power firmly in the hands of local white elites in the South, agricultural policy became a tool to enforce segregation. During the summer of 1954, there was the opportunity for Southern leaders to form a plan for the integration of schools. Several religious denominations supported the Brown decision, at least in convention. Logically, such plans should have been worked out with African Americans. Instead, there was silence until the citizens' councils and political leaders decided to revert to antebellum rhetoric. Wilma Dykeman and James Stokely put it succinctly in their book, Neither Black Nor White. Our political leadership might have come forward and led us. Our newspapers could have been more constructive. Our churches might have proclaimed the light with a little more heat. But nobody filled the vacuum until the white citizens' councils got underway, and the politicians saw that they could make hay on the issue. And then the main chance was gone. Wilma Dykeman complained to author Lillian Smith that reviewers slighted her book, and Smith warned her that the media had no use for white Southerners who championed integration. Smith detested editors Ralph McGill, Harding Carter, and Harry Ashmore. In her opinion, they were self-proclaimed liberals who did not favor integration and ignored those who did. Smith's articles and letters protesting segregation went unpublished. Mississippi and South Carolina were the toughest states when it came to civil rights. The Best White Citizens chapter focuses on Mississippi in the 1950s, with the Citizens' Councils, with punitive agricultural policies, and with violence. Despite the repressive atmosphere, African Americans organized to vote and to attend white schools, often at great cost. Such World War II veterans as Medgar Evers, Amzie Moore, and Aaron Henry formed the backbone of resistance, and they had a structure in place when SNCC workers showed up in the 1960s. I attempted to raise questions about who controlled resistance to the Brown decision, and of course the Citizens' Councils were in the forefront of many such organizations in the South. There were, according to a report H.L. Mitchell did, some 550 segregationist cells in the South that registered over 200,000 people. Nearly all of the post-Brown organizations were composed of middle-class people. Indeed, the Citizens' Councils boasted that it contained only the best white people. Without the respectable leadership of middle-class whites, however, there's the likelihood that many Southern whites would have simply gone along with integration. One of the most intriguing questions, as I mentioned earlier, is why no opposition group emerged to oppose the Citizens' Councils or the segregationist politicians. Proponents of integration were picked off one by one, shunned, boycotted, vilified. Nearly the entire Southern delegation to Congress signed the Southern Manifesto. Why did no group rise in opposition? There were many brave whites who risked their lives, their homes, their reputations to fight for civil rights. And given some leadership, perhaps they could have started another party. I have also attempted to deal honestly and compassionately with Southern segregationists. Many segregationists were church-going folk who would never admit to being racist or to hating African Americans. They did admit to favoring segregation, and they had a glossary of reasons to support it. Throughout this section of the book, I let these people speak, let them explain and have their arguments. Their language goes deep into Southern history, of course, into the turn of the century segregation that became legal, into the eugenics movement, and into some of the writers of the 20s who were defenders of whiteness. While some ministers boldly proclaimed that Christianity was inclusive, others stood by segregation. In her letters, Lillian Smith had a great deal to say about Southern ministers and their bravery. One of the most rewarding experiences in doing this book was spending a week reading Lillian Smith's correspondence. At one point, I'd written an entire chapter on Lillian Smith. Then I had combined Lillian Smith with Ella Baker and composed a chapter. And then I had to take the parts and put them throughout. But Lillian Smith was a fascinating character. And the first two photographs in the book are of Ella Baker and Lillian Smith. And through the Smith papers, I learned of Jane Stembridge, who I'll talk more about later. At the South Caroliniana Library in Columbia, I found the papers of the South Carolina Council on Human Relations, and in particular, the story of Alice Spearman, who was the director of that organization. Such women were extremely important in the South in the 1950s and give lie to the notion that Southern women, black or white, were inactive. Spearman emerged as one of the most fascinating historical figures I've encountered, and she deserves a lot more historical investigation. And despite all the recent scholarship on the Central High School crisis, which just passed its 40th anniversary, I waded in with Bibles and bayonets, in large part because most treatments ignore the role of working-class women, religion, and African Americans. It puzzled me, for example, when I read newspaper accounts of the mob in front of Central High School, that it was described as gallous, spittled, violent, and male, while photographs and TV footage showed women in dresses, men in khaki pants and nice shirts, children, pastors, and very few people in overalls. And this myth continued, I think, because the people in the press, nor the people in Little Rock wanted to admit that it was their working class people who were out there in the streets. They wanted it to be outsiders from the Delta. Radical Departures concludes the book and attempts to view the years from 1960 to 1964 through the eyes of Ella Baker, Lillian Smith, Jane Stembridge, Fannie Lou Hamer, and Leslie B. McLemore. There's no way to underestimate the impact of the sit-ins that began in 1960, nor the role of Ella Baker in shaping SNCC out of those who were most visible in the sit-in movement. She resisted the lure to incorporate SNCC into the NAACP or CORE. She set up a headquarters in Atlanta. Jane Stembridge happened to arrive fortuitously and started doing their newsletter. And Ella Baker wanted to form a grassroots movement that would overthrow Jim Crow, and she thought this was it. In many ways, she resembles Bill France and Sam Phillips in her ability to take these brave young people and mold them into a force that had revolutionary power. Leslie McLemore, who appears in the final chapter, grew up in Walls, Mississippi, and attended Rust College, where he joined the NAACP and then SNCC. Les worked with Ella Baker here in Washington in the summer of '64, preparing for the Democratic National Convention, which was held in Atlantic City. He not only worked with Ella Baker, but with Mrs. Fannie Lou Hamer, who spoke before the Credentials Committee that summer. Dr. McLemore described the almost insane bravery of SNCC workers who went into the most vicious counties of Mississippi. Indeed, a month ago I was in Jackson for the Fannie Lou Hamer Institute, which he founded, and he was talking to the teachers there who were part of that, and he again reiterated how much bravery it took. The way he said it was, you wouldn't go into Sunflower County. You wouldn't go into Tallahatchie County, but people went. Let me read you just a little bit here about this part. Because it's a letter that Jane Stembridge wrote, it was at this juncture well, let me start on the next paragraph because I don't have much time. Quoting her, "The beginning of Freedom Summer in Mississippi," Stembridge wrote on June 23rd, "is that 3 people are missing and have been for 48 hours, somewhere out in Neshoba County, where they say they killed 6 blacks last year." Letters like that make your hair stand on end. I mean, you feel like you're there with her when she wrote it. She wrote a letter that winter that I'll read just a quote from. As Christmas approached, Stembridge's letters and reports recorded the unemployment, the harassment, and her rising frustration. She was in Greenwood. "From here," she said, "there has been no breakthrough, not one scrap of evidence that we are overcoming. No lunch counter in downtown Greenwood is open to Negroes. No public school desegregation has occurred. No jobs have opened up. And very, very few people have been successful in their attempts to become registered voters. Even if black folks could sit at the Woolworth's lunch counter, few could afford a cup of coffee. The masses are huddled around tiny gas stoves," she went on. "They're poor, they're hungry, and they're cold." I remember vividly the night when Mrs. Hamer gave her talk before the Credentials Committee. And also I vividly remember the night I was writing this section of her testimony. I can still hear her voice from 1964 when she was telling about what happened to her when she stopped to use the restroom. And she was testifying before the Credentials Committee so that the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party would be seated instead of the regular Democrats who were all segregationist, racist, and had run the state for all those years. And as she began her testimony, and Les McLemore was there, and he said there was hardly a dry eye in the whole committee. Lyndon Johnson cut in with the television, into television with a news conference to co-opt it. But the networks ran it that night in prime time. And of course, the testimony was riveting. And Johnson offered a compromise that he would allow 2 people from the Freedom Party to be seated along with the regular delegation from Mississippi. And the delegation argued about this and decided no, they wouldn't take the compromise. And this is the way I wrote that, starting out with a quote from Mrs. Hamer. "We didn't come all this way for no 2 seats," Hamer explained a few days later. "The Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party delegates refused to compromise and returned to Mississippi. When Freedom Summer ended, so did the promise of spontaneous grassroots revolution. The moment was lost." And when I'd written that, I stared at the screen for a few minutes, and I realized that I'd finally put the puzzle together. Until that moment, I thought the book would be called Revolutions. After all, so much had changed since World War II. But as I allowed myself to think backward from that moment in 1964, I realized that so much more had been lost. Thank you. I'd be glad to try to answer some questions. Yes.
When I first opened the book and read the first chapter, I was struck by the fact that you focused specifically on 2 women, and I was wondering whether you consciously focused on them because they were women or because they just happened to be active and you weren't consciously bringing them in, as women. Or in other words, did you make a conscious decision to focus on particular women, or is that just part of it?
Well, as I mentioned a while ago, I had a whole chapter on them at one point, a whole chapter on Lillian Smith at one point. And as I was taking that material and weaving it into the book, they moved to the front, to the introductory part, because they were so much a part all the way through, from beginning to end. They were people who were active from the beginning to the end. So, and I think they were 2 of the most important women who were operating in the 1950s.
You didn't say to yourself, okay, I got to find some women.
I didn't have that problem. Women were there. I didn't have to find them.
Actually, I have another question. I just finished reading this, so come on with them. And I think you and I discussed this, but I'm going to ask you again. The chapter on the race car drivers, it seems to be, there's a lot in there, but it seems to be just the tip of the iceberg, so to speak. And I was wondering if you maybe rethought you said you weren't going to elaborate that into an entire book. But I
What, stock cars?
The chapter on, the stock car driver. Because I think that, there's so many characters in there and just so much interest, and especially the connection with the fact that they started out trying to elude the revenuers, going down those mountain roads. That was great. So I was wondering if you would rethink your decision and maybe look into it a little further.
Well, I'm going to look into it a little further because I'm working on an exhibit on NASCAR. I don't intend to write a book on it. I intend to do an exhibit on it. But yeah, somebody should write the book. Most people go out and interview any driver, mechanic, or hanger-on who was there in the beginning, and whatever they say, it doesn't matter. They transcribe it and put it in a book. NASCAR speaks, drivers speak. So there's all this going on. And someday I may write more on it, but I doubt it.
You mentioned earlier that the Science in American Life exhibit influenced the way you handle the agriculture issue and about the chemicals. Could you say something a little more specific about what it was that you found when you were doing that exhibit that changed the way you were writing that?
When I started working on Science in American Life, I knew very little about science except what I learned in college. But as I got into the chemicalization of the 50s, it was just this enormous change after synthetic chemicals. DDT and 2,4-D in particular came in after World War II, and it just took over. And there were all these implications of these chemicals I had not suspected. I knew that some of them were dangerous, but I didn't realize that the Department of Agriculture, for example, and the Agricultural Research Service were promoting their use even when they knew how dangerous they were, and that the Agricultural Research Service knew that the milk supply of the country had these pollutants. There weren't supposed to be any. They never revealed that to the public. It was a public relations problem. If they could keep it a secret, then it was not a problem. Same thing with the meat supply. The meat had residues because cows grazed on grass that had been sprayed with chemicals, and the residues, of course, of these chemicals go to the fat. And when people eat the meat, they get the residues, and it builds up at the top of the food chain where we are. And of course, this was going into baby food. They were terrified that the public would find out that there were these pesticide residues going into children. But they never announced it. They never took any action. They hoped that someday the people who made chemicals would come up with a chemical that was mild and wouldn't do this. So I got fascinated by these questions, that how can you do this? And that's why when I said, when Rebecca Lynch and I found these pictures, it was just, here are these pictures that they're just like us. But in other ways, I hope not like us. Yeah.
On that farm chemical note, was this whitewashing that you talk about successful? Or, can you see sort of prefigurements of the sort of environmentalism of the 60s? Did you find those sorts of things sort of nascent in the 50s? As far as, were farmers, were the people involved, was there a sort of resistance to chemical use, or not really at all?
I don't think farmers resisted at all, because when DDT came on the market, it was a miracle. It was treated as a miracle, even though, as Edmund Russell's work shows, during World War II, the military only adopted it as an emergency measure, and it was not tested, and people didn't know what it would do. But after the war, it was put on the market with the knowledge that it was dangerous. But most people didn't know that, so they used it. There's everybody tells me they ran around behind the DDT sprayer in their community when it came around, and played in the fog, played hide and seek in the fog. And the same thing for other chemicals. And so people embraced them because they were so effective. And they weren't given enough information. They were always told, if you follow the rules on the bag, there's no danger. Yeah.
Was there then complicity between the companies that were making those chemicals and the agriculture
Research Service?
Yeah. Is there direct stuff, or because it sure sounds like that there might have been?
I would assume there was, because they said these people were always roaming the halls of the Department of Agriculture, some of the letters I read. A man from the meat packing industry showed up, and it was some of his letters that gave me the most insights into this meat residue problem. And he was there for damage control. So I think there was. That's a good subject for somebody else to look into more deeply. I think it's question over here. Go ahead.
As a northerner unacquainted with the terrible story of the fire ants, could you explain that a little bit? I know they're nasty, but they were handled badly, apparently.
It was a long story. Fire ants came here from Argentina in the 1920s probably, and another group came a little later. And they're not spreading much until around the 40s and 50s, and then they sort of started spreading. And they're a nuisance, and they sting. At this time, there was in the north a big spray campaign, and in the west there were spray campaigns, but the south didn't have, there's a gypsy moth and there were all these things. The south didn't have an enemy. The fire ant was way down the list of pests, but the Agricultural Research Service promoted it. There were articles in the paper that told of fire ants that killed children, pigs, quail, and so forth and so on. So it rose to the top as this great predator. And these horrible stories, describing, them eating things. So they built up enough support so that they began this major spray campaign. And they sprayed practically the whole South. You had no choice. They sprayed you whether you wanted to be sprayed or not. And it was with dieldrin and heptachlor, these chemicals much more powerful than DDT. And it killed animals. It killed livestock, for example, in some cases. The ARS covered it up. They never admitted it. They had misleading testimony to Congress, but they kept getting appropriations and they kept spraying. And it's a nasty story. But the kicker is that after all this spraying, there were more fire ants than there were when they started, because fire ants are very resilient and they're terrific breeders. So it killed everything, including some fire ants. But then the fire ants had an open range, as they say, and they just spread everywhere. And so there's this little catch to it. So it was just a horrible campaign, and they probably still spraying for fire ants today. It's not over. Yes.
It's another northerner. I'm not sure I understand what you were saying. Well, I'm sorry. Well, I'm not sure I understand what you were saying about the roles of the, with respect to the citizens' councils and racist demagogue politicians, the role of the elite as compared with the working class and the poor whites. And, what might have been, perhaps, or was it inevitable?
Could everybody hear this? She wants to know the role of the sort of the class analysis of the Citizens Council, the Klan, and other segregationist groups. And okay, well, all politicians were segregationists. I think I can say that without fear of contradiction in the 50s. The people who were for segregation, most white Southerners were for segregation. And a lot of them said they were just vehemently for segregation. But there was this seam within that vehemence that had leadership come and said, yeah, we know that everybody wants to be segregated, but the Supreme Court's made its decision. But the people in the Citizens Council were middle class to elite. They formed these organizations that were respectable, and they forced people to belong. If you were a white citizen in a small town in the South and you decided that no, you were not going to belong, chances are people wouldn't buy from you anymore. People would shun you. And if you came out for integration in schools, then you would be totally ostracized. So it was a great cost that people opposed this. Whether the poor people favored this so much is a mystery. Now, usually the Ku Klux Klan is portrayed as a working class organization, but the Klan wasn't all that strong in the 1950s. What was really strong was this middle class Citizens Council. So, in my opinion, they deserve all the credit for what they did to preserve segregation, to promote violence, to terrorize people who didn't go along with them. The Klan, of course, had its terror also, but I don't think we should look at the working class as the reservoir of segregation and racism that it's always been portrayed as.
You were saying that it wasn't inevitable that the segregationists, that the Citizens Council would win, that something could have happened differently.
Yeah, the question is, it was not inevitable that the Citizens Council would do this, and I don't think it was inevitable. I think that had there been wise, considerate leadership, that things could have been different. And as it was, as I mentioned, the people who came out for integration were picked off one by one, and they were very brave, but against this kind of opposition, they had very little chance. Yes?
I'll be brief. I noticed you mentioned a woman you thought was wonderful, and she wrote about the masses. Well, anyone who writes about the masses, that's rather arrogant, to write about the masses being poor. But I lived in South America, and it's a peonage system there, as it is in the South, of economic and social, and many young whites are trapped also in that system, and therefore they wanted to resent being even trapped further in that peonage system with no really economic or educational mobility. And when you know your history of the South and Reconstruction, people have memories when there were abuses after the war between the states, and one group went to Brazil, and then the rest stayed, and there were a lot of abuses there. So there is a resistance that people don't know unless they were born into that heritage. I know in South America, in Brazil, they even have hierarchies on 8 or 9 skin colors. That's always been there. It's a worldwide phenomenon. And I went to a meeting on the American Friends of the British National Party, and the same thing is going on with world integrations, 100-year population mixing of different cultures. So there are clashes. It's economic, and it also is spiritual. But I skimmed some of your book. I wondered why you didn't mention more of the Reconstruction in the South, why this is a peonage system. Not everybody understands that.
Well, I did a book on peonage. So I didn't include that in this book.
Maybe 1 or 2 more questions.
Okay, 1 or 2 more questions.
Pete, one of the characters that comes through very strongly in your book is Sputnik Monroe. I mean, I think he and Sam Phillips are the 2 men who come through the most charismatically. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about Sputnik.
I could talk all night about Sputnik. At the book signing I did in Memphis, Sputnik sat beside me, and when this woman came up at the first of the signing and said, after I'd signed, and she looked over at Sputnik, she said, "Would you sign your photograph?" He said, "Page 127, sweetie." Sputnik Monroe was a wrestler in the 1950s, and even though he's how old now? 73. The earth still shakes when he walks. He's a wonderful person, and in Memphis, he was the hero mostly of African Americans because he fought the pretty white guys. And wrestling in the 50s was brutal. He has a little respect for what goes as wrestling today. But he taunted white people about the color line. He would walk down Beale Street. He dressed very, very sharply with his bowler hat, his suit. He would walk down Beale Street. He would go where he wanted to. He would violate all the segregation rules. And I'll just tell you briefly how he got his name. He said he'd wrestled somewhere out in Missouri and was driving back through Memphis, and he picked up this black hitchhiker, and he says, "Look, I'm really tired. Could you drive me to Mobile? Because I have a wrestling match there." And so the black guy drove him to Mobile. And when he got there, they become buddies. So they were standing around in the wings waiting for the wrestling match to begin, and Sputnik had his arm around his new friend just chatting with him. And this set off this white woman in the audience who started screaming, vile things, to the point where they had to warn her to control herself. And so she finally choked down enough to say, "You're nothing but a damn Sputnik," because this was the fall of '57. Sputnik was up there. So the name stuck. The man who introduced the wrestlers that night, knowing a good thing when he heard it, introduced him as Sputnik Monroe. And so he wrestled in Memphis. Eventually, he became so popular that the black people who were assigned to the balcony, there were so many that they had to finally integrate downstairs because they were more greedy than they were segregationists. So he played when we had interviewed him last November, we were walking down Beale Street in Memphis, and this black woman who was younger than I am walked up and she says, "I know who you are," and he gave her a hug. And she says, "I've never watched you wrestle, but my father watched you every Saturday." So he had not lived there since 1960, early 60s, but people recognize him wherever he goes. He is a legend and a wonderful guy. How we doing? One more? Okay.
You mentioned that you didn't see any leadership to speak of at all. I think of the Anniston Star in Alabama, Louisville Courier-Journal as being led by liberal people that did speak up. I'm not sure about the 50s, but certainly by the early 60s. You're not in agreement?
I think that in the 60s, the press was very valuable in the sense that the people who were like SNCC workers and other people who were really fighting for civil rights, about the only hope they had for survival was if the press were there, with cameras to photograph what was going on. And I'm sure some of you in the audience remember watching that on the nightly news, and you were horrified at what was going on. And so that was, the press did play a major role. But to say that Harding Carter was an integrationist is just not true, or Ralph McGill. They, in their own words, say they're not. But over time, people have come to believe that they are because they wrote brave editorials about doing better things, and did want a better life for African Americans in the communities where their newspapers were. But they didn't want integration of schools.
One more.
Yeah.
The anti-segregationists who did emerge, were they mostly in rural areas or urban, or was it a mix?
I think that what I've read in letters and all, it was a mix. There were brave people everywhere. There were pastors who got up and lost their pulpits in small towns and large towns. And there were principled people who stood up and all over the South. And they were picked off one by one, like I said. But it was not just, there were people of conscience everywhere, and there were brave people everywhere. And some of them paid an enormous price for their bravery, but they did that because it was better to speak your conscience than to live without speaking it.
Thank you, Pete, and thank you all for coming. I did want to announce that there's a gray SUV up front with the lights on, and the license plate is 7W9930. Thank you for coming. The books are for sale at the front of the store. Pete Daniels will be here to sign the books. And if those of you sitting on the folding chairs could help us by folding your chair and putting them on the side, that would help both us and people not trip. Thanks again.